Good morning, everybody. I'd like to add my welcome to this session, and I'm really sorry not to be with you today. I'm very excited to talk about this very important topic. My name's Barbara Evans. I'm from the University of Leeds, and I'm part of the Future Climate for Africa programme. Most of my work is focused on East Africa, but I'm also working in West Africa, and we're really looking at the practical implications of climate change on people's everyday lives in cities, particularly with respect to the interaction between flooding and sanitation. So in this presentation, I'm really just going to look at the overarching ideas around climate change and sanitation. And the key points really are quite simple. The first thing to say is that we know that sanitation coverage in urban Africa is relatively low, and a lot of sanitation provision is of fairly poor quality or is delivered in areas which are very informal. And for those reasons, there's a lot of excreta in the environment. There's excreta which is on the ground, there's a lot of excreta in the drainage networks, and that's really what creates the big health hazard associated with sanitation. We also know that the main weather-related stress on that system is to do with heavy rain and flooding. Although droughts are important and they do have a big impact on urban infrastructure, it's flooding which has the most significant impact on sanitation, partly because it spreads excreta around the city very effectively. What I want to just talk about in this introductory video is that we really need to think about the effect of this interaction between flooding and sanitation at three scales. First of all, the effect on domestic facilities and services. So how does that affect the functioning of toilets which are in people's houses or compounds? We need to think about the effect on the collection and conveyance of excreta, so the effect on sewer networks and the effect on trucking systems and road networks. And then we need to think about the effects on the treatment of fecal sludge and wastewater, so the potential damage to wastewater treatment facilities, for example. Why do we care about these effects? We care because if we understand those effects at those three scales, we can start to think about what are the interventions that we might want to be planning that can make the system more resilient at all three of those scales. Historically, I think what's tended to happen is that there's been an undue focus, for example, on the large-scale infrastructure, so on protecting treatment plants, for example, but much less focus on how to keep collection and conveyance systems operating. So going back to the beginning, just to say, I think we all know that sanitation coverage in urban Africa is quite low. On the left here, we can see the summary statistics for Africa as a whole and compared to the world as a whole. And on the right, we can see access to safely managed and basic sanitation for all of the countries that fall within the United Nations Africa region. The most important thing to notice here is that we have very little data for Africa on safely managed sanitation. And that's because there is very limited data on the extent to which excreta pass all the way from collection in the toilet to end management. And in urban areas, that's a symptom very often of chaotic systems, quite a lot of informal systems, systems which are not captured by utility information systems. And that very lack of management is one of the problems that we have to worry about when we think about this interaction between sanitation and climate. Just to sort of turn that into reality, what we really are dealing with here are systems which are made up of all sorts of different elements. From the very large-scale formal infrastructure which exists in some cities, through informal and formal collection systems, conventional and community-based sewer systems, and then right down to manual emptying and the management of domestic sanitation. So we're really dealing with, in almost all of the cities that we're talking about, we're dealing with these quite complex, multifaceted systems. As a consequence of that, there's a lot of excreta in the environment. Some people in this meeting, I hope, will have seen what we refer to here as a shit flow diagram. So this is a tool that we use to estimate approximately the amount of excreta which is unmanaged and which is in the environment. I've chosen here to just show you the ship flow diagram for Kisumu, with apologies to my colleagues in Kisumu. Kisumu is not by any means the worst city, but just to show here that in Kisumu, the major problem that we have is that a very significant portion of the contents of pit latrines and tanks, which are emptied by pit emptiers, are not delivered to treatment. So we get a very large amount, about half of the excreta that's produced in Kisumu, which makes its way into the drainage system in various ways, either into sort of waste ground and then gets washed into the environment, or directly dumped into streams and drains and into piped drains in some cases. So that's the excreta, that's a large amount of excreta which is lying in the environment and which interacts with a flood when a flood occurs. So the main climate-related issue is flooding, and when that flood occurs, because we have these quite complicated, chaotic systems, we get a lot of effects. Now, I've just picked out here some photographs from some field work which we've been doing. These photographs are actually from Kampala. But just to say that we know quite a lot about what happens at the domestic level once we get a flood. We know that people quite often wash out their pit latrines or tanks. Some pit latrines or tanks may be damaged, the actual superstructure may be washed away. People will often just retreat from flooded areas and revert to open defecation or using alternative sanitation facilities. So we get this very immediate localized effect when we get flooding. We also get community level effects. So we get problems with access to areas. So one of the things that often breaks down as soon as you get a significant flooding event, of course, is the trucking service. So it's very difficult to evacuate and clean up septic tanks and pits once the ground is waterlogged. We might get even a lot of damage to road structures, to bridges and to culverts and so on. So the damage to the network, if you like, is quite significant. One of the things we know as well is that these effects carry a high cost. One of the ways we can calculate that cost is to look at the extent to which people invest in additional protective measures to try and keep their domestic sanitation or their trucking operations functioning during a flood event. So we've got quite a lot of information about the costs which are incurred by individual people and by city authorities trying to cope up with the intersection of these flood events with sanitation. Now, I mentioned earlier that it's quite important to think about these impacts at 3 scales. And this is true irrespective of whether we're thinking about on-site systems, so systems which are using pit latrines or tanks, decentralized systems which might have local decentralized treatment, or centralized conventional sewage systems. In all 3 cases, we have essentially a domestic scale. We have the place where the toilets are, if you like. We have the emptying and conveyance system, whether it's trucks or pipes, and then we have the treatment services at the extreme right-hand end. One of the things to think about here, and just to confuse you all, we've flipped over the diagram here, to think about this in this context is that the living environment, the service delivery or community environment or collection system, and then the city scale facilities, including the treatment, in all of these cases, there is also an intersection between the sanitation system and other infrastructure services. So we often think about the connection with water, but we also have to think about the connection with the energy network, for example, the transportation system, solid waste and drainage networks, and telecoms. So we're very much interested in all 3 of these domains. Now, the city level infrastructure is highly concentrated, it's quite focused, but it's expensive. So damage which occurs to, for example, wastewater treatment plants incurs a very high cost, but is technically quite easy to manage because it's in 1 or 2 locations in the city. And at the same time, at the household level, we have lots of potential to intervene and create much more flexible and adaptive systems that can enable people to cope with the intersection of flooding and poor sanitation. I think one of the biggest challenges when we think about weather-related risks and future climate-related risks and sanitation is how we deal with these community-scale services. So how do we think about making our transportation systems more resilient so that our sewer networks and our trucking systems can be more resilient? And later on in the session, we're going to hear from a number of colleagues working at city level about various things which have been done in a whole range of different cities to try and make parts of this system more resilient. And the thing that I would encourage you to think about when you're listening to those voices is to try and ask yourself, in every case, are we actually creating resilience across all three of these scales, which I think is probably the secret to solving this problem. How do we go about this? Well, one of the things that we're doing in FCFA, which I think is very important, is to try and make reasonable estimates of the effects of the intersection between weather-related events and poor sanitation. And one of the things we're doing is trying to understand and quantify the public health implications of these events, because we want to make an economic case for improved investment. But I also think from a technical point of view, we're very interested in identifying what are the critical improvements across all three scales, and also understanding the interlinkages between, as I said, these different service deliveries, the sanitation, the drainage, the flooding, so that we can prioritize hotspots or critical, if you like, pinch points in the system. Now, to give you a couple of concrete examples of this, at the service delivery scale, so at the level at which we are thinking about transportation networks, we've really got to think about making sure that the city remains connected. And this has several dimensions. I mean, one is the obvious one of improving urban drainage so that we reduce the effects of flooding. So here we might think about understanding where are the critical floodplains and infiltration basins. How do we protect critical local infrastructure so that we make sure that we don't get informal settlements in very, very critical floodplains, for example. It's also very important to think about solid waste management, making sure that we actually have regular collection, that we're dredging out drains, that we're managing tipping and litter, because it's essential that drains work when floods occur. We need to think about the road network and identify the critical junctions and bridges, reducing the risk of collapse, making sure that we've sized things adequately. And then if we do all of those things, we can start to consider whether our sanitation network, the critical routes for maintaining sanitation management, have been put in place and can be maintained. But the point I want to make here is that this middle scale, if you like, this service delivery scale, is very much more about active management of urban services than it is about infrastructure investment. A huge amount of what we need to do here is think about proactively managing and connecting together solid waste management, drainage, and sanitation together. There are, of course, also things that we can do at the household level. One of the things that I think we don't think about often enough is that a lot of sanitation collection systems, so pit latrines and septic tanks, are very large. And I do sometimes wonder if we need to think in flood-prone areas about, in fact, providing much smaller sanitation systems that need to be much more regularly emptied and maintained, just so that we reduce the total amount of excreta which is lying around in an area which is liable to flooding. So, for example, thinking about using container-based service providers for critical flood-prone areas. And then I think the other thing to think about is identifying the critical parts of the system where it's worth investing in additional flood protection. If we're thinking about these types of interventions, of course, it's very important to understand what's going on. So I just want to mention also, and you'll hear some stories later on about the importance of collecting technical data that is both formal and also informal. So the voices of community members who often have very interesting and perceptive understanding of how flooding actually occurs in their city. This is just some work that we've been doing in Kisumu. And linked to that, I think it's extremely important to have a very good inventory of the types of sanitation systems and their management in critical areas, so that we can start to understand where we're going to find these critical risks. So just to reiterate, and sort of looking forward to the rest of the morning session, what I want you to think about as you're listening to other speakers are these key points, really. First of all, we know that the sanitation coverage in Africa is generally low, and in cities is often of poor quality. So we need to think about what are the dimensions of sanitation quality that could be improved in order to make systems more resilient, so that we have a lot less excreta in the environment when floods occur. We have to accept that the main weather-related stress of flooding will carry on and will probably get worse in many cities, and therefore we need to understand the implications at these three scales: the domestic scale, the service delivery, collection, conveyance scale, and the city level scale, or the treatment level if we're thinking about sanitation. I hope that during this session you'll hear a lot of very interesting and inspirational thoughts on how we can make sanitation more climate resilient. And I really am optimistic that we're going to start to see a step change in the quality and the sort of diversity of investment that we see, so that into the future we're seeing much more sustainable and safely managed sanitation systems. So thank you very much for listening, and I really hope that you enjoy the rest of the session. I'm very sorry not to be there, but I'm really looking forward to hearing the results of this session. Thank you very much.